Hello viewers, and a warm welcome to the show today. My name is Chef Andy, your host, and today we're going to have a surprise on the show. As I mentioned earlier in the previous episodes, we are going to be doing a series of episodes where we're going to be hosting some very interesting guests on this show. And on this particular episode, I'm going to be focusing on one particular guest that you may have already seen on the show before. His name is Noam. And without further ado, welcome Noam.
Hey Chef.
Hello.
How are you?
Good? Thank you.
Habari yako?
Mzuri sana. You're good?
Yeah.
Nice. Now today on the show, we're going to be focusing on something very different. I'm going to have Noam make us something very beautiful from the Holy Land. And I'm also going to be pairing that with a very simple dish that we're going to be doing that is also locally inspired. With that mentioned, we're going to be doing a very simple beef stew. And of course, Noam, what are you going to be making us today?
So again, I didn't know I was supposed to come and make thing. I thought I'm just going to come and make you some wine. But if you really want my cooking skills, and again, I'm not really skilled in that art, but I will try my best. But you mentioned something about chapati, right?
Yes.
And I love chapati. Yeah. And my middle name is Chapati, is Noam Chapati. No, it's not. But as in Kenya, chapati is one of the key ingredients in the nutrition. In Israel, we have, actually all over the Middle East, but I'm from Israel, so we'll talk about Israeli kitchen. We have a thing called lafa. Now the lafa is basically chapati, but much bigger.
All right.
Then I know here what you do, how do you call it? You what's the name of the movement when you eat with the chapati?
You
like
dip
with the
it?
ugali, you dip it. Yeah.
You dip it in the sauce. Yeah.
So in Israel, what you do, you take the big lafa, it can even be like this big, and you roll ingredients inside. It can be beef, it can be chicken. So basically it's like a pita bread, but much more flat and big. Okay. So today we will try to make a Kenyan Israeli chapati that is basically the same make measurement and make ingredients, but we're going to use a bit of our za'atar. That's the flavor of Israel.
All right.
And we're going to use, of course, all of the regular ingredients. That it's flour, olive oil, maybe a bit of chili, we'll see, a bit of sugar, and yeast, of course.
Perfect.
And we're going to drink a lot of wine with that.
Exactly. Now remember, we are going to be doing a series of episodes where we are going to be teaching you and showing you some beautiful pairing techniques that you can also be able to do in your very own home. And on this particular episode, Noam, what do you have for us today?
So today we have a beautiful wine called Vision Merlot. Now the winery, we talked about the same winery last episode, it's Tepperberg. Tepperberg, that's the oldest winery in Israel. They are producing wine in Jerusalem more than 170 years. It's very interesting because Israel, it's been around only 71 years. So actually 99 years before Israel was a country, this family was making wine. It's a Merlot, that means it's a dry, full body wine, but this specific wine is very unique because the complexity of the flavors and the depth of the flavor of the grape and a bit of the tannin from the oak just merged to a beautiful wine. And because we're going to pair it with meat, I think the combination is going to be outstanding.
Perfect. And of course, as we always mention, very important to always remember that if you're going to be pairing some meat, remember always to choose the best alternative. And of course, we don't limit you to the one that we have on the counter today. You can, of course, go into your retail stores out there and you can find a big selection to choose from. But before we begin this, Noam, I will allow the guests to take a very short break. And when we do come back, we'll just get messy on the counter.
I'm going to start opening that one.
And we'll, of course, sample a bit of some wine. So please don't touch that dial. We'll be right back. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. For those of you who missed out on the introduction, I'm going to be co-hosting the show today with Noam. Now, he's a very good wine specialist who I've actually had the privilege of hosting on the show today. And all he's going to do is he's going to also be giving you some beautiful tips and tricks around different pairings of wine. of course, to mention that this is, of course, a family show, so you do may, of course, want to inform or excuse your kids at this point in time. And if, of course, you do actually want to have them as part of the show, be sure to mention to them that this is particularly for the adults only. Only. All right.
You ready for a bit of sip?
Yes, let's go for it.
We just do it the proper way. As we mentioned, the reason why when we're going to take the cork up, we're going to use the cloth is because sometimes we have a bit of aluminum foil on the top of it from the cup. So when we do it like that, we actually eliminate any chance of that going into the wine. And because not everybody are hygienic like us and wash their hand before they open a bottle of wine, so you need to make sure always, even when you open a bottle of wine, to wash your hand.
Exactly. One point to always remember, especially for instances such as pouring wine, remember it's very easy to contaminate the bottle by using dirty hands or infected hands right over the top. So as Noam mentioned, very, very important to always make sure that you take quite a bit of precaution, especially when opening up a bottle of wine. And as we've mentioned as well, we are going to be pairing this, so you may actually also want to take a bit of detail down that you can, of course, take and use the same recipe that we have on the show today without, of course, using any of the wine. And you can, of course, also include some wine if you're, of course, looking at that. Salut. Nechaim. Very, very good, as you mentioned as well. Yes, very, very good. All right. That is as simple as it's done, ladies and gentlemen.
We're going to come back for it after, yeah?
We'll come back to that in a little bit.
Just to make sure.
Exactly. Now we're going to start this process very, very simply. We're going to, of course, work with the dough. So as I mentioned, Noam, we're going to, of course, use a bit of your za'atar and a bit of some flour. So very important to always remember to have some flour that you're going to be using, and of course always have some flour on the side which you're of course going to be using to dust your surface with. Of course, very important to mention, have some water which you'll be able to mix your dough in. Very, very important to also have a bit of salt. And last but not least, a bit of some olive oil, which of course
the best olive oil
comes, it's actually here though. This is of course brought to us by Noam as well. Very, very good Israeli variety olive oil. And this is basically what is going to bring the beautiful touch of authenticity to this very simple dish. All right, Noam, so we'll start you off by grabbing, of course, some of the tools you will require.
All right.
Anything else?
I'm grabbing the tools I require. What else?
All right. Now we're going to start off.
Well?
Exactly.
What else?
Now we're going to start off the process very simply by sifting our flour. So you may want to pour that in.
Here?
Exactly.
In specific rate? Or?
No, just go for it. There we go.
And
then you can use the side of your hand.
I cannot
and just
do it, but I just ask him that you will know how to do it as well.
Exactly. So just tap it very lightly, yeah? Right up until the flour is all in the bowl.
Okay. Now why basically we do it? Why shouldn't just put it in the bowl?
One beautiful thing about using a sieve is two things. Remember, sometimes you may actually have foreign bodies in your flour, and this will always aid in making sure that you don't actually have this going into your dish. So one beautiful thing about the flour as well is it also fluffs up the flour, making sure that your flour is nice and airy before we proceed to add any ingredients.
And I'm really glad I'm wearing a black shirt while we're working with a lot of white dough today.
Well, it'll actually bring some beautiful authenticity to the dish.
Okay.
All right, so once that's done, I believe you'll proceed to add a bit of salt.
In my special way, my special technique.
In your special technique, of course.
The Turkish technique. Well, that was a bit, most of it was outside, okay. A bit more?
Perfect, yes, a bit more. There we go.
A bit more.
Right. Next up, a bit of some za'atar powder. And maybe you can also give them a bit of an idea about za'atar spice. Very, very good.
So za'atar basically is the fragrance of the Middle East. It's a well-used combination of spices and herbs that come from different countries. So every country has its own different ingredients. Usually it's between 5 to 10 different kinds of ingredients. It can be thyme, it can be a bit of sesame, it can be oregano, and each country has a different kind of method how to combine it and different colors. So let's say the Israeli za'atar will be very, very greeny. The za'atar from Lebanon will be a little bit more dark brown.
Okay.
And you can even get something that is little bit look like yellowish.
Okay.
More south around Egypt.
All right.
And we use za'atar in most of our vegetables, spicing on herbs. Use it on cooked vegetables on the oven, use it on fresh salad, on eggs, on meat, basically on everything. You can even eat it like that. Everything. I'm gonna have like green in my teeth. Yeah.
All right, so in goes a bit of some za'atar
How
powder.
much do you want?
So we're going to be measuring out into that about half a tablespoon.
All right.
So you may want to just pour that on. Keep going. That should be okay. So that can go into your bowl.
Excellent.
Perfect. And now very, very importantly, as I always mention when working with flour, very important to add your liquid in a very, very slow motion, or rather in a very, very consistent motion, because you of course don't have an idea of how much water you will require. And of course this is also measurable in dependence to which flour you're using. Now in this particular dish, we're going to be working with all-purpose flour. So Noam, you may want to dig your hands in there and give it a bit of a mix with your fingertips.
Okay.
Right, simple technique. And this basically allows for you to make sure that your salt and your za'atar spice is basically nicely spread out before proceeding to add some water.
And the question I have in my mind, how should I clean my hand after it? On my shirt or?
Actually, there is a very, very beautiful technique I'll show you, but be sure not to wipe your hands or wash them right up until the end of the process.
Okay.
Remember, ladies and gentlemen, very important to make sure you don't waste any of your ingredients. So be sure to finish off doing your dough right before washing your hands. So you can put we're going to be using one hand to mix, so you can use your right hand.
Okay.
And of course your left hand will be able to hold on to your bowl.
Okay.
And very, very simply, you're going to proceed to add your water. So I'm going to start with about 1/4 cup. And we're basically going to allow that to mix through. We'll of course have instances where it will actually start to form a bit of lumps. Be sure to continue mixing through. Remember, this is one particular way of making sure that your water is completely absorbed. And you can, of course, proceed to add your water in little amounts right up until you have your dough reconstituting into one big bowl.
I really hope I didn't try it, because to mess up a dough, it's like the least complicated thing you can do in the kitchen. If I wouldn't make that.
And for some of you who may also have the ability or have the privilege of having a mixer in your kitchen, you can of course always use the hook, which is the attachment that looks pretty much like an arm, and that can also aid you in combining your dough very, very gently. Right, so this is almost done now. We're going to add about just a tablespoon.
Okay.
Then what you want to do is also rub the dough around the bowl, making sure that all your flour is mixed in there.
Mix nicely.
Exactly. All right, and as we continue to mix the dough, very important to always remember to add your oil at this stage.
I have to say, it's a lot of satisfaction to see flour becoming dough.
Exactly. Right, so in goes about 1 tablespoon of some cooking oil. We're going to be using olive oil for this recipe. Remember, we are being very authentic with this dish.
Yeah, and this olive oil is coming from the Golan Heights, and that's the #1 olive oil in Israel in the last 3 years. It's extra virgin first cold press, so the flavor is actually very, very bitter. That's the flavor of the olive. Now, it's very hard to find pure olive oil in Kenya because of a variety of reasons, but this one is, you can actually smell.
And it
actually,
yeah, it does actually bring a nice, beautiful nuttiness to it. And if you're, of course, a big fan of consuming olives, very, very easy to relate, especially to the nose. Right,
Okay,
now
the
that's
dough
nicely
is
constituted.
ready.
That is perfect. Right, so you can just proceed to just add some flour to your hands.
Okay.
And all you're going to do is now, using both hands, begin to rub everything into the bowl. And this is a particular, very simple technique of making sure that you don't actually lose some of your dough to the sink, and that everything stays in the bowl. Yeah?
Never lose food to the sink.
Exactly. And of course, being that you're also working with the recipe, remember, losing any bit of your ingredient at this stage could actually change the consistency and the result of what you're making. So be sure to always, at least in your very best, try and make sure that you don't actually lose any bit of your ingredients, because it could actually change the consistency of your dish.
I think we can go
All right.
and play tennis with this. Beautiful dough.
Simple as that. So as I mentioned, it will constitute into one beautiful ball. And once that's done, very important to also mention that you should also remember to rest your dough.
Can I tell you a funny story? Just remind me. So when I was a kid, and how old are you?
I'm about 33.
Ah, so you're young.
Yeah.
I'm 34 in 1 month. So when I was young, in my city, we didn't have a lot of things to play around, and we lived in the desert. And one of our best games, it's like a very stupid game, children don't play that. We used to go to the desert and make, we call it kabuba. So we used to take, like making dough with sand, with a lot of water, make like balls, and then you put a bit of stones inside, make it strong, and then you throw it on your friend's head.
Something to mention as well for those kids who are watching the show today, please don't try that at home. As we mentioned, this was a game that was played in the past.
Yeah.
We have of course evolved, and we now have tennis balls and all kinds of balls that you can play with.
Yeah. No, but it's actually this feeling of making the ball take me back like 33 years ago.
Nice.
All right, the ball is ready. What should I do now?
All right, so very simply, we'll proceed to dust the bowl.
More?
No, that's okay. And then, of course, dust a little bit right over the top. And what we're going to do is we're going to cover our dough, which will allow that to rest anywhere between 10 to 15 minutes, giving us just a bit of time to proceed to start on the meat. Right, so very simply, you can, of course, cover that with some cling film like I just did. And you can, of course, alternatively use a wet cloth that will go right over the top, and that will allow for your dough to also stay nice and moist right up until the time you will use. So this will allow to sit right behind us as we continue. And Norm, you can take your chance now to rinse your hands off before we proceed.
So close to put it on my shirt, but
exactly. I insist, definitely. No, now, while we do so, we are going to give you this chance to unwind. And when we do come back, I will, of course, have the station nicely cleaned up. And we can, of course, jump into the next part of the show. So please don't touch that dial. We'll be right back. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. If you're just tuning into the show today, as I mentioned in the introduction, I'm going to be co-hosting the show today with Norm, and we're going to be making a very simple dish. And we pretty much started by making our dough a little earlier, which is now in the resting stage. But now we're going to proceed to begin this second part by cleaning some of the meat. So Norm, you'll do us the pleasure.
All right. Which kind of meat is it?
This is basically beef. And we're basically going to be using beef off the bone. So this was locally purchased. This is not any particular cut, for those of you who may be worried about what particular cut of meat this is. But this is particularly one that came off the joint, the rib bone of the cow. Very good, very good marbling of some fat. And the beautiful thing, exactly, and the beautiful thing about this is the beautiful content of fat that it contains allows for it to cook and become very tender and very juicy. So we're going to start off the process by taking the meat off the bone.
Okay. Assess.
Exactly.
Where the bone is. Something like that, basically.
Exactly.
All the way.
So all you're going to do is cut right around the bone.
My mother never let me play with knife, and I'm glad that you let me play with knife.
Exactly. And something also important to mention for those of you who may actually be fans of cooking with your kids in the kitchen, be very cautious about leaving them or allowing them to work with knives, especially if they're not experienced. And if you do actually love the attention of your kids in the kitchen, always take a bit of time to make sure to teach them the best way around it. And this way you'll not actually have any accidents that are unwanted in your very own home.
So how did I did?
So far so good.
Yeah.
Now we're going to do the same thing for the next one, but before we do so, we're going to proceed to cut that into some cubes.
Cubes?
Yes.
Okay, that's going to be
So we're going to start by cutting that into a strip
like that?
of about that thickness.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
Really nice. All right.
Exactly.
Now
Now proceed to do the same thing with the rest.
How big should be?
That should be about 1 inch in cube size. So once you've taken that out, you can pretty much, okay, continue.
I think
That should be okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Now
You can, about that chunk, yeah, about that size. Yeah. All right, so as Noam continues to do so, I'll also proceed to prepare some of the ingredients that we'll be cooking with. So I will start by slicing up about half a piece of white onion.
Can you teach me how to slice that?
Yes,
Can I slice
definitely.
the meat?
Actually, I'm going to allow, no, it will actually not be very easy to do so with meat. Right.
See, perfect cube.
Perfect cube. Just about that size will do. Remember, the reason why we are cutting those into chunks, we are going to be frying them up and they will actually shrink in size quite a little bit. So very important to give it a little bit of a size so that you can actually be able to cook it down into one that's a little more easy to chew.
Chef, you know what I'm missing? Positive reinforcement from you. It's very important that you will tell me that I cook well, that I cut well. Maybe give me a glass of wine.
Of course, maybe you can actually sip some wine at this stage.
Thank you. How long a man should wait for a glass of wine?
Thank you very much. Salud.
Now, the reason why I mentioned is the glass of wine, not because I like to drink, but because we're going to cook with it as well, right?
Exactly. Now something
So you can cook with your wine, not from my wine, okay?
Exactly. Now something also to mention, wine is a particular beautiful additive to food. It is of course pretty much a very European way of European style of cooking, but of course in the recent past we have of course incorporated a bit of wine cooking in the country. You'll of course be able to see this in your restaurants within the city. You will of course occasionally be able to see maybe a steak or a piece of meat that's actually paired to a sauce that's also made from some wine. And there are of course also very many dishes that are particularly composed with a bit of some wine addition. So please don't feel a bit of a shyness in you to try cooking with some wine. It is of course a very different style of cooking.
I'm starting to get it in my eye.
All right, so I'm just going to finish this off.
And I'll just say one thing about cooking with wine. We are producing in July, Nairobi Wine Festival 2019. And during that, we're going to have live cooking station paired with wine. So dishes infused with wine, prawns with wine, meat with wine, even cupcakes made with wine. So if you're around, make sure to come and see, and then you can learn more about that. So my objective feeling is that my cubes were perfectly symmetrical cubes. I think that's the best cubes you ever saw in your life. Should I do that as well?
Yeah. Do the same thing for the second piece.
Okay.
Now, so for some of you who are, of course, big foodies and, of course, food enthusiasts, you can, of course, be able to catch Noam at the, what was it called again?
Nairobi Wine Festival 2019, 5th, 6th, and 7th of July in Trademark Hotel.
Trademark Hotel is a place to be. So if you do want to catch up with Noam and, of course, be able to air out some questions or even some opinions about the show, you can, of course, be able to do so through our Facebook page. That's BrandPlus TV Kenya. Or you can also be able to walk up to Noam at the event and you can, of course, be able to share some of your beautiful tips to him.
But not walk up to me all together, one by one, okay?
Definitely. All right, so as Noam gets to the end of that...
Do we want fat on it, by the way, or no fat?
Pardon?
Do we want a bit of fat?
We want a bit of fat in it.
Okay.
Of course, for this particular chances,
This is not good.
we can, of
This
course...
is good.
This is a good cut. Yes. So as Noam proceeds to do so, I'll begin by heating up a pot that we'll be cooking with. Now, some of you may not have actually been able to see this in the market that is with us at the moment, but you can actually be able to buy one of these at your regular Juakali artisans. It is a particularly very cheap, different kind of pot to cook with. And one thing I particularly like about this is the ability that it can actually contain much more steam as opposed to your regular pot. It also does come with a very thin side.
Sorry, I have to take
right,
time.
I
can open my eyes.
No problem. Now what happens is the beautiful thing about this beautiful pot is it's actually very good for boiling and broiling meat. And this is particularly why I've actually chosen it for this particular recipe. So we're of course going to start off by cooking down our meat, of course allowing it to of course tenderize and of course cook down that bit of fat. So thank you very much.
Show them how beautiful
Now, as you can see, some very, very beautiful chopping skills from my guest. Now, we're going to, of course, proceed to add this into our pot. So I'm just going to dump that in there.
Chef Andy, those one we can recycle, we can use, we can give it to our pets. What can we do with that?
To mention, if you actually do have any particular trimmings from your meat, such as this, remember you can always fry these a little bit, or you can actually put them to the boil. It will actually give you some very, very good stock, especially from the bones, and that can actually also aid in giving you a nice, beautiful addition to your dish, which is, of course, a substitute to using water. Right, so meat is done. You can also get rid of that. Right, now as we continue, I'll of course just move these onions into a bowl on the side.
Now, can you give us a tip, professional tip, how to handle onion cry in the kitchen?
Actually, it's actually a very, very good tip, Norm. Now, one particular technique I like to share with most people, you can of course wash your onions before slicing. Another simple technique I like to use is you can actually throw your onion in the freezer about a minute before chopping. Really? And what happens is it actually concentrates the juices to the bottom base of the onion, and this will actually allow you to be able to chop your onions without having to tear.
Okay, good.
So two very important tips. You can rinse your onion, and you can of course throw it in the freezer just for about, and of course don't keep it in there too long. It will of course be impossible to chop. Yeah. So just about a minute to a minute and a half, peel it, chop it. You should be able to do so without a tear inside. Right, so Noam,
yes,
I will of course bring you back to the chopping board once more. And I'm going to ask you to chop up our tomatoes. Now, a very, very simple technique of chopping tomatoes without actually losing that base at the end, Noam. Very, very simply, you can grab this. Okay. And all you're going to do is make... No, what happens is it's actually a little easier to do so with a small knife. So what you're going to do is you're going to grab it with your thumb almost towards the tip of the knife.
Okay, that's new.
All right. And all you're going to do is make a small hole just around the sides of the eye of the, yes, and then you can easily go right around it. And this particular technique actually allows for you to be able to get rid of that eye of the tomato without actually slicing it off and losing a chunk of your tomato. Simple as that. And you can do the same thing with the rest. And please, of course, discard this. Remember, this is particularly very, very disturbing to pay attention to, especially when you're enjoying a meal. So be sure to always get rid of that bit before you proceed to cook. And now while Noam proceeds to do so, very importantly, we'll start by boiling our meat. So I'm just going to allow about twice the level of the water measurement to the meat. And this we're basically going to put back on the heat and allow that to come to the boil very, very briefly. All right. In the meantime, of course, giving us a small bit of time to be able to finish chopping everything else. What should I do so now? For this, we're going to first of all chop into quarters.
Quarters?
Yes.
Quarter, that's mean 4, right?
Yeah, 4 pieces.
And quarter is 4.
Exactly. And then once more.
Okay.
And then now you're going to cut this into half.
Each one of them?
Each one of them. Okay. Now, this particular technique of chopping tomatoes is particularly very, very helpful, especially when making stews. What happens is the tomato, being the chunk that it is, actually allows for it to break up very, very gently while simmering with the meat. And what happens is at the end of the process, it will actually be able to cook into one beautiful consistency, and you will actually be able to get your tomatoes to break up a little slower, allowing for your sauce to also continue to gradually build with a bit of thickness.
Okay.
Right.
What next, chef?
Right, so once that's done, we're going to add that into the pot on the side, so you can throw that in here.
Oh,
don't worry about it.
Okay.
Right, once that's done, we are going to proceed to chop up some of our other ingredients. So you can, of course, go in by chopping up some of our coriander. Coriander is a very, very beautiful addition to sauces and, of course, to stews. Brings a nice, beautiful mellowness to the dish, and, of course, also aids in combining most of your flavors.
Now let's see if I can chop like you.
Exactly.
Without chopping my hand.
So far, so good. You're doing okay.
And that's the last part. That's the most frightening.
That's
part.
a tricky part. Your
finger.
fingertips off.
Okay.
All right. No
Now
traces
again.
of blood so far, so we are doing good at the moment.
How chopped do you want it?
That's as good as you can get.
Right.
All right. Once that's done,
Throw it to
you can of course pour that into the bowl.
Okay. You want me to chop the flour or the?
No.
Right.
All right. Now once that's done, we're of course going to allow our meat to continue coming to the boil, and of course give that a bit of time for the tomatoes to break apart. But before we continue, we are going to allow you for a very short break, and when we do come back, we'll also bring you back to scratch with the bread. We'll also of course show you how to cook it and roll it out, and of course finish off the last part of the dish, which is our stew. So please don't touch that dial. We'll be right back. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. If you're just tuning in, then you probably missed out on what I and Noam have been doing for the last two sessions. We are working towards the last and final part of the dish. And of course, we will have to bring you back to the dough that we made a little earlier in the show.
Beautiful dough that
Very,
Noam
very
made with his
beautiful
own
dough.
2 hands in the first time.
Exactly. Now we're going to start off the process by rolling this out. So Noam,
should I
you
do?
may want to. So what we do, very important tip I could share, always begin by dusting your flour.
Okay.
And what this does is it will actually also absorb any smell or any aromas that are on the counter, making sure that your dough is of course not involved in it.
Okay.
Yep. So very simply, begin by reconstituting your dough into a ball. Very easy to do by hand.
Okay.
You can give that a try. Aha.
I should put a bit of flour in my
Yep,
hand.
yep. Aha.
Yeah. much
Give
more
that another try.
Okay.
All right.
Now,
Right, straight onto the counter.
hard, soft,
Soft,
not hard?
not
Or
hard.
like
No.
bash it?
No. There we go. Right. After that, just dust very lightly with some flour right over. And you're going to require that. Of course, grab some flour.
Yeah.
And what you'll do is you will dust the rolling pin right over that, so you can hold it right over the top.
Okay.
And what you're going to do is basically just rub the flour on the rolling pin.
Is that?
Exactly. Work your way around
Okay.
perfectly. And what this does, ladies and gentlemen, is it actually aids you in rolling, and it also helps in making sure that the flour doesn't stick to the pan while you roll out. Right, now proceed to roll out that as you would for chapati
Or Israeli
or
laffa.
Israeli laffa. Uh-huh. Right. And of course, while that continues, also always make sure to have a pan that's already on the heat, ready to go.
It's beautiful. You can actually see a bit of greenish color because of the za'atar. So when we're gonna fry it, it's gonna look beautiful.
And as well, you can also be able to depict the spices coming right through. You can see specks of that beautiful sesame seed and the za'atar spice.
Okay, I think we are almost
there.
there.
Uh-huh.
Should be perfect round, but it's clearly not, but it's okay.
No. I actually have a trick just for
Really?
you on that. Yes.
What to do?
Now what we
like
will
to
do?
the pizza?
Yes. So what we will do, especially for those of you who may actually also find it quite tricky in working with flour, I'll help you on that side. So very, very importantly, very important to make sure that your surface is dusted. So that's one issue that makes it hard for most. And then of course, once you turn it over, dust once more. So the idea is to always make sure to have a little bit of flour on the surface.
Okay.
And this will basically allow for you to roll very, very easily.
Again, I'm very glad I brought black shirt to the show
Exactly.
without knowing we're gonna deal with dough. Okay, now how we can make it more round?
Right. Now you can roll it out a little bit more.
Okay.
Yeah, it can go a little bigger. Right. Now this is a very, very simple tip I'm going to share. One that particularly helps those who are actually having it very, very hard in rolling their chapati perfectly. So what you could do, Mr. Noam, is basically hold a plate right over your dough, just to make sure it's actually in line. If it's still small, means you need to roll out a little further. So what happens, you should actually be able to see the outline of the dough right around the sides of your plate, just to make sure that you can be able to cut a size that's big enough.
Now I get the trick.
Now you get the trick.
I'm gonna cut it in the shape of a round plate.
Exactly. Which of course is one tip that you can also be able to use, especially if you're having it hard to impress your guests and you're looking for that perfect chapati. This is a very, very simple technique. So very important as well, always dust anything that comes close to your dough, making sure it's also dry. And all you're going to do is place your plate right over the top. And using a pizza cutter, you're just going to go right around the rim of the plate. And this is a very, very simple tool to use as well. For those of you who've of course tried and probably of course purchased the same equipment, you will actually be able to realize it will always save you, especially when working with flour, because it actually continues to spiral as you cut, making it easier for you to continue working undisturbed. Okay. Right now you can take the sides out completely.
Then we can make another baby laffa chapati with this.
Exactly. So you can now begin to roll that into a ball again.
Okay.
But of course, always something also to remind you, it may of course not be the same consistency as the first one. It will have a little more flour.
Yeah.
So one technique you can also use is you can also rub some water on your hand, and it will also bring the dough back to the same consistency. Right, so while you roll that,
what is the water?
You can actually just dump your hand very, very slightly like that, yeah. So just rubbing, or rather just brushing your hand right across the sink on some cold running water should actually give you quite enough moisture for you to be able, and I think you can feel it, it's nice and soft. Yeah. Right, now you can lift that, or you can use that. There we go. And as you can see, it actually makes it so much easier. And another thing as well is you actually get the center that's actually almost the same consistency right through. Right. So just detach the sides and then work towards the center. So you can go right around with your fingertips, making sure it's not stuck. Yeah, very gently just go right around.
I'm not gentle enough. Okay.
No, you should be okay.
All
right. So very simply, begin by making sure your hands are well dusted off. And all you're going to do is you can also shake it like that. And what happens is actually comes off the counter a little easier. Or you can also use your pizza cutter and detach the edges. And this will of course always happen, especially if you're using a heavy plate to do your cutting. So you can of course improvise with a lighter plate that will of course not exert any pressure onto your dough. Right, now that is almost out. As you can see, it comes out nice and easy. Just be sure to rub it on the surface of your working area.
With a heart-shaped chapati.
Exactly. Actually, it's, for the fact that you're also trying it out for the first time, maybe you can of course come back later on in the show and pretty much give us an idea of how your next trial goes. Yeah?
Okay, no problem.
Yeah, be sure to try this out at home. All right. So onto the pan goes our heart-shaped chapati. And as you can see, once it's on the pan, there's also a very, very simple technique of getting the shape right. So you can also use your fingers like that and pull it wide open, and you should actually almost get the round shape that you were looking for. Simple.
To flip it, we just go like...
Now you can of course use that technique to flip, of course, if you have the experience and the technique.
I want to try it.
Then definitely we're going to give you a chance to. So we're going to allow that, you're going to allow that to dry off a bit more.
But what
So-
will happen if I will do like that and it will fly over my back?
Now, what happens is it actually will be easier towards the later part of
Okay.
the cooking, because what happens is the dough will, of course, lose a bit of water, making it actually lighter.
Alright.
So when you attempt to toss anything of such nature, of course, give it a bit of time to cook off. It will, of course, reduce in weight quite slightly, making it a little easier to move. And of course, another very important tip to check for is, of course, the dark part of the dough. So as your dough continues to cook, it should actually start to turn almost white on the particular areas that are fully cooked. And it will, of course, start to become very, very crispy towards the top. So as you can feel the top, it will actually start to become a little dry.
Yeah, I can actually see it as well.
Exactly.
Okay.
Now once that's done, you can of course move it towards the edge of your pan and just lift it slightly and check for coloring. If it's still very, very white, you can leave it on the pan. And what you're looking for is some specks of some brown,
Yeah.
but not black, not so black, but a bit of some dark brown spots. That should of course give you the hint to of course turn it
Okay.
over. Now while we continue, I'm also going to just clean up the station.
Let me clean it. I did a mess, I will clean it.
All right, go for it. So you can just dust that down very quickly. And now, of course, we're going to go to the next part of the dish, which was the meat that we had started a little earlier. So this we allowed to simmer for about 15 to 20 minutes, and we turned off the heat completely, allowing it just a bit of time to cool off. That should do for now. And now all you're going to do is pretty much remove the meat from the liquid. So you may want to grab that and the spoon. And what we're going to do is we're going to begin by removing the chunks of the tomatoes and the meat to begin with. And of course, very important to mention, don't discard the liquid at this point, because you will actually be able to use it in cooking a little later. And you can of course also freeze it and allow that to set in your freezer. And once you get those beautiful ice cubes, you can also be able to use those to flavor any particular dishes of the same kind. Yeah. And it's actually a very good tip that I learned over the years, especially for some of us who are not big on enjoying ice cubes. Do actually take the chance to use your ice trays. So all you need to do is make your stock, pour it into the ice tray, allow it to freeze, and of course take 1 or 2 pieces when you're cooking, throw that straight into the pot, and it'll just infuse with everything else. All right, so this is out. Now we're going to come and check on this.
I want to flip it.
All right, let's go for it.
Okay.
Uh-huh. There we go. Nice stuff. Very, very good attempt, Mr. Noam. Now, one question I could, of course, ask, when you're making this bread traditionally, would you, of course, add some oil on it?
Definitely.
So we are going to be
Definitely.
adding some oil to that. So to aid
Cheers.
that, of course, we've got some olive oil at the back.
And olive oil.
Uh-huh.
Not a lot.
Uh-huh.
Just a bit to get
Right
flavor.
over the top. Uh-huh.
Yeah, a little bit here to get beneath.
Uh-huh. And then you can just shake your pan around.
Here
And as you can see, a very, very different technique of making chapati, a different kind of style. And as I mentioned, there's plenty recipes out there, some that have not even been tested. But I always insist, if you do actually have the time, try the techniques in your very own kitchen. You may actually have that 18th recipe that we don't actually officially have, yeah? Nice stuff. All right, so now we're going to allow this to finish cooking.
Okay.
And I'll just grab a plate for you to move that onto. All right, now we're now coming up to the last and final part of the dish. So we are going to be cooking our meat very, very briefly, but I will allow this to come out of the heat. So with the use of that, you can of course turn
Now
that
I
over.
can from here
Uh-huh.
flip it to a plate.
No, but what happens is
without
that
closing my eyes.
now what happens is, of course, you will allow for the oil to seep through very, very nicely. And once that's done, you can proceed to move that onto a plate. And voila, simple as that. Now, Noam, what would normally happen? Are we going to slice this, or are we
we're
going
gonna
to
leave it like that.
We're going to leave
Now,
it this way?
usually,
Uh-huh.
when it's dried, it
Uh-huh.
needs to be flexible enough that we can roll it.
Uh-huh.
But let's just see how we're going to go with the meat,
Uh-huh.
and then maybe we can roll it together,
Okay.
or we can just cut it and have it in pieces.
Actually, I think what we'll do is we'll have it in pieces, because I do have another episode coming up in the week to come, where we're of course going to be showing you how to focus on some beautiful tortilla wraps, which is of course the same technique Noam has mentioned on the show.
Will I be invited to that show as well?
Yes, you will actually be. I will actually have Noam on board on that show, and I will of course be also teaching you a nice different recipe that we're of course going to be blending with some white wine. So of course, if you do have a beautiful recipe to share with us, do bring it along with you.
Well, I
next
have
week.
a beautiful wine, white
Exactly.
wine, so we'll bring it with the recipe.
That's perfect.
All right,
Now I'll
what's
move you to
my
this side.
next assignment?
Now what we're going to do next is we're going to change pans very quickly. All right, and onto a clean pan, we're going to begin to reheat our pan. I'm just going to get rid of that flour. Now what you're going to do now is you'll begin by cooking down your onions. So I will be adding a bit of some olive oil into the pan. Now you can add your onions in.
All of them?
All of them, yes. There we go. And now we're going to allow that to come to the heat very briefly. This is for you. Right, now we're going to allow the onions to sweat off very briefly. And in the meantime, we're of course going to add the rest of our ingredients. So I'm going to of course be assisting Noam, and he's going to be doing the cooking for today. So very simply, I'll begin by cleaning out a bit of garlic. Very simple technique, yeah? You probably used that before?
Yeah.
Nice. Right, so proceed to pop open your garlic cloves.
How many are we going to use? 4?
We're going to be using 3 pieces for this recipe. And you can actually use 2 large pieces, yes. Right, so to that, very simply, we're going to chop those into some nice big slices. And what you're going to do is we're going to add that to our pan. Right, now give that a mix. And while that continues, we're of course going to add some of the rest of our ingredients. So I'm going to begin by adding some curry paste.
Wow.
And this is basically going to give it a bit of heat.
A bit.
Yes,
A bit or
quite
a
a
lot?
bit of heat. Then of course next up, also add in your tomato puree.
Right.
Right. Now that will of course start to thicken quite a bit. So this will call for the addition of some wine.
No!
So we're going to...
Wine.
Actually what happens is at this stage we're actually going to be adding the wine to begin to flavor the base of the sauce. And it will also aid us in breaking down the consistency of the tomato paste as well as the curry paste. So that's going to start becoming a bit of a thicker sauce as you continue.
Okay.
And at this stage you can now add the meat
We're gonna use
and the
the chili?
tomatoes. Yes, we are. Now as you continue to finish off your recipe, we're going to proceed to also slice in a bit of some bullet chili. Now this particularly is not very hot, so we can of course use the seeds in this as well. But very important, always remember to break off the stem because this is not particularly edible. And all we're going to do...
Some peppers, the seeds are toxic?
No. What actually happens is the seeds are very good antioxidants. So if you actually have the chance to cook with seeds, please use them. They do actually carry a very good antioxidant. That's also the key ingredient in making some beautiful pepper sauces such as Tabasco. The hint of the Tabasco actually comes from the seeds, and it also pretty much brings a beautiful flavor right around. Okay, so once that's halved, we're just going to slice that into some big chunks. Simple as that. Then you're going to add that into your pan. Very importantly, always remember to season your dish. So we're going to add our salt at this stage. Now, as you notice, remember we are making a stew. So very importantly, to always have a bit of water or some stock to add.
Making really nice color and fragrance.
So we're just going to add about a cupful of water into that. And now what we're going to do at this stage is basically allow the water to blend in with the flavors. And what happens, it also changes the consistency of the sauce, bringing it to something that we can be able to dip our chapati or any particular bread that you may be having, or even as well the laffa into your beautiful sauce pot. But before we proceed, we are going to take one last break, and when we do come back, I will take you to the last and final part of the plating, and of course share some beautiful serving suggestions for this dish. So please don't touch that dial. We'll be right back. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We're right now at the last and final part of this simple dish for the day. As I mentioned, we are going to be serving a very simple beef stew with a beautifully inspired, what did you call it? Laffa bread. Now we're going to finish our stew very simply by adding in our coriander that was to go in last. Remember, this always brings a nice, beautiful color difference, and of course brings about a harmony in flavor. And once your coriander is in, you can turn off your heat completely. Proceed to mix through. And once that's done, very importantly, always remember to season. So be sure to add a small pinch of salt towards the end. Mix through once more. And now this is ready to serve. Now also to mention, in the glass on my left hand is the liquid that we had a little earlier. As I mentioned, we did boil the meat and the tomatoes. And this is basically the difference in color that you may actually encounter, especially if you're boiling meat and of course adding a bit of vegetables to it. It could of course have a bit of color to it. But as I said, as long as you keep your ingredients clean and you of course keep your method clean, you could actually be able to go quite a long way with the bit of liquid that's left off in there. So as I mentioned, very simple tip. You can add that to an ice tray, freeze it in the freezer for maybe overnight to 2 nights, and you can of course be able to take out 1 or 2 pieces as you go along. Now we're going to start off by plating this simple dish. So now maybe you'll do us the honor of moving the bread to the plate. Aha.
Not sure if
Chef's touch. Aha. So far so good.
Voila.
There we go. Simple as that. Now to finish that off, Mr. Noam, I'll give you the honors.
Thank you very much, Chef.
And as you can see, as I mentioned also a little earlier, very many variations to cooking. And of course, with different touches and different origins of flavors and of course ingredients, you can of course bring the very simplest of dishes to your dinner table.
Like bringing the world to your doorstep.
Exactly. Perfect plating there, Noam.
Thank you very much.
Compliments for that. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we've right about come to the last and final part of the show. I will, of course, allow Noam to give our recommendations for the laffa. What would you alternatively have had that with if you're right at home?
If I would at home, I usually have the laffa with the shawarma bread, the shawarma meat.
Okay.
It can be chicken, it can be lamb. Or we actually take it with the labane. So labane is a cheese. It's a Middle East cheese that is a little bit bitter, a bit of olive oil and za'atar, mix in the chapati or with the laffa.
Okay.
It's amazing. So you can have, if you're vegetarian, you can have the laffa. If you eat meat, carnivore, you can eat the laffa. I really want to try that one because it looks and smells delicious.
Thank you, Noam. Now, I will bid you farewell at this point in time, of course asking you to do tune in to many of the next episodes to come, where of course I'm going to be hosting Noam in a series of events of course giving you a bit of knowledge on wine pairing and of course incorporation of wine to cooking. But for this, Noam, I think it's about time for us to say goodbye and dig into this beautiful dish.
Definitely.
Yes, so from the studios, thank you once again for tuning in today. Do have a lovely night and God bless.
Thanks, guys.